She gripped the paper clipboard like it might tether her to the floor, like the printed intake questions and the cheap pen could anchor the part of her that kept threatening to float away. The waiting room smelled of lemon disinfectant and cheap lemon air freshener, the fluorescent light humming above like a small, steady clock. Sophie's heart kept stuttering against her ribs in a rhythm that felt too loud for such a small room. He came in the way a scene remembered itself, composed, a little weary at the edges, hands steady even when his shoulders carried a weight. Dr. Daniel Hayes moved as if the world required neither his permission nor panic to continue. Sophie's eyes saw glasses, a precise jawline, the kind of haircut that sat as though it had been instructed to be unremarkable, and succeeded. The other people in the waiting room, mothers scrolling through phones, an elderly man with a newspaper folded like a shield, didn't look up, but Sophie did, because she had to, or because she couldn't not. "Miss Bennett?" he asked when the nurse called her name, and the voice matched the face, calm, careful, the sort of voice that aimed for clarity where someone else might squeeze a hand too tight. She stood because she was told to stand, and the clipboard shook a little less when she tucked it under her arm. Up close, his eyes held something like professional reserve and an odd softness that made her stomach drop and her palms go slick. He introduced himself, said a few things that were procedural and precise, and then asked the question that made her feel naked in a way a medical form never would. "How long have you been feeling anxious like this?" "Months," she said, and the word left her with more honesty than she meant to give. He listened as if each word mattered in the same plain currency. No pity, no dramatic pause, only an intentness that made it harder to armor herself in silence. The appointment was brief and thorough. He explained things in terms she could follow, not too clinical, never condescending, his fingers careful when he took her pulse at the wrist when exams required it, his touch steady enough to be a promise and careful enough to remain a line. Sophie noticed every small practical kindness, the way he unfolded a paper towel before letting her sit, the way he explained the next steps as if there would be a next. When he left the room, she felt the odd light absence of him like someone had turned down a lamp. She left with a referral letter and a follow-up appointment scribbled on the back of a small paper bag her nervousness had found somewhere to put itself. She walked home across streets that smelled faintly of rain and bakery bread, and the city closed itself around her in familiar, safe smallness, her bookshop on the corner, the cracked sign in the window, the soft bell that announced customers like old friends.
She liked her life because it was small. What it lacked in glamour, it made up for in the quiet certainty of routine. She did not expect to find his other life inside her phone, yet the world was always a few taps away from revealing its double. She should not have clicked the article in the middle of sorting new arrivals. There were bindings to check and covers to face the world, but curiosity is a tiny thing, and when it claws, it claws. Headline: Dr. Daniel Hayes launches new clinic fund. Philanthropist doctor is clinic regularly sought after by society's elite. There were photographs. Daniel in a suit that cost more than the shop's rent for a month, smiling at a gala, a sash of ribbon cutting a ceremony where other well-fed, well-buttoned people cheered. A separate piece, an opinion column, the journalist had titled with something colder: The Perils of Hero Worship in Medicine. They all meant the same things to her in different tones. The word millionaire hovered in the middle paragraph, gilded and large on a screen that suddenly felt too small. She read with that peculiar kind of vertigo you get when the floor you thought you were standing on is suddenly recognized as someone else's. The man who had measured her pulse and asked about her sleep was the man who could appear in Sunday papers and philanthropist lists, and that unset estrangement from her own class moved like a small, sharp stone into the center of her chest. She ducked into the back room, palms on the counter, blinking because she had not cried and yet felt them anyway, an embarrassment she could scarcely name. It wasn't just the money. It was the difference, the way other lives moved in a parallel and glossy train while hers hummed along a less conspicuous track. She'd been raised to believe men like him were future chapters in magazines, not quiet intimacies on a Monday morning. When he came by the shop later, he had a way of finding places he liked. She felt the fragile balance of the previous hour tilt. He timed coffee orders and small talk like a surgeon would time a stitch. He noticed the books on her desk and asked about an author with a care that made her forget for a second the headlines. Sophie tried, clumsily, to fold the two Daniels into a single person in her head. The man who eased her anxiety with simple explanations, and the man whose life mapped a different social geography. It wasn't easy to reconcile the way he knelt once, only once, to pick up a copy of a battered Alice Munro for her because she had left it behind, with the photograph of him cutting ribbons next to a philanthropist with a pearl necklace. There was a layer of guilt to that, the suspicion that if either of them saw her too closely, they might find in the intersections something that would not fit their narratives. He didn't ask her why she was guarded. He never had to. He read people the way a musician reads a score, a little hesitation here, a chord unresolved.
The quiet effort he made to be gentle, coming earlier than necessary, leaving her a note with a recommendation, felt like both kindness and a kind of trespass. Sophie found herself guarding the small life she'd built, the shop, the cat who slept behind the stacked rugs, the paycheck that came with the comfort of knowing what to expect. After one evening shift, when the streetlights hummed through rain and the bookshop's bell sounded less like welcome and more like a hand closing on a small window of solitude, she stepped out and the city sounded far away and too large. Her breaths came uneven and she felt the familiar rushing wave, panic, without an obvious reason. The pavement lurched under her foot in a way that made her stumble, and then everything tunneled down to the pulse in her ear. He was there in the way drama bends the world toward people like him, first a face in the crowd, then a hand at her elbow, then words that cut clean through the fog in her head. "Sophie?" he said, and for a moment she thought she might be a figment of an anxiously silent narrative designed to be steadied. "Sorry," she managed. You're having an attack." He said it plainly, and there was no judgment in it. He took her home like one would carry a fragile parcel. It surprised her because this felt different from appointments and polite clinic talk. It felt like someone had crossed a private line and found it acceptable to be near her. In the hospital, he moved with the confident economy of someone who belonged in white coats and staff IDs. He sat with her in a plastic chair and refused tea when the nurse offered it. He explained things again in the backsplash whites of the emergency area: breathing techniques, time, follow-up. When the beeping from a monitor blended into the background, he was there, a presence neither overwhelming nor light. He kept his professional face when he needed to, but he did not hide the tremor in his expression when she was quiet. At one point, he reached out and brushed a damp tendril of hair from her temple, a motion so small it could have been habitual or nearly anything else, but it tugged at her like thread. She had been careful. She had not been careless enough to write his name on a napkin and hand it to him, or to say things that made other people in the waiting room look away, but she had been careless in her mind where no one could read, thinking about him in ways that felt dangerously private. When he said, suddenly, with a softness that startled even him, "I like you," the words landed like a pebble tossed into still water and rippled. Sophie caught the edges of it. She should have been flattered or elated or afraid. She was all three and more. She thought of her mother and the steady list of practicalities that stitched their lives: rent, grocery money, phone plan payments. She thought of the headline she had read about palms that shook other hands and gave other donations.
She thought of other women who were not her, who might move differently in rooms meant for comfort and for politics. She wrapped her hands tight around the paper cup of lukewarm hospital tea and whispered something that had been colliding with all she'd felt. "If they find out, you lose everything." The sentence left her like a confession and a command. It was not only about him. It was about the structural knife that could cut both of them. The risk to his license, his reputation, the clinic's reputation, and the way their names might slake gossip pages and boardroom whispers. It was also, in the small, private, bone-deep way she felt, a selfish plea that he remain safe, because she did not know how to bear the cost of him being harmed for whatever their fragile closeness might become. He listened, and in that listening there was no flinch of contempt. For once he looked like a man deciding something heavy. The clinic hunted him for his results. The town liked to pin simple narratives on complex people. He had his money, everyone knew it, and that should have been armor. Instead, it stood between them like glass, something to be admired, the light bending through it, but impenetrable without consequences. "I know," he said, softly. "I understand." He did not say, "I don't care," even though a part of him hungered to. He did not promise to keep it secret.
Instead, he did the thing that made him still feel like a person worth trusting. He reached for the only form of protection that wouldn't be secrecy. "I will not treat you privately," he said, "not while I am still the physician at Hayes Women's Health." The words were the most responsible thing he could offer. It was small but exact, a formal boundary that acknowledged the heart's unpredictability but didn't hide behind silence. He reached for his phone with hands that shook just a little, dialed the director's number even as he murmured, "I need to initiate a transfer of care. I need to disclose a personal conflict." It was the sort of sentence that would, if spoken in certain circles, ripen into paperwork and conversation. It was also the kind of sentence that might cost him favors, chairs on boards, invitations to philanthropic dinners. Sophie almost stopped him. She imagined his life narrowed by a line item, personal indiscretions. She imagined the press angle and knew how cruel it could be to watch someone you like become newsprint. She did not want him to resign. She did not want his life to fracture because of a moment that held potential for gentleness. But she also could not be the person who asked him to hide his humanity in a closet and pretend it didn't exist. "Please," she said, quiet. "You don't have to." He finished the call with the crisp efficiency of a man whose day job was to make decisions under pressure. "Hello, Director Carter," he said into his phone. "This is Daniel Hayes. I need to talk about a patient. Transfer of care. There may be a personal conflict."
He used the words cleanly, even though the tremor in his voice might have given away his concern. At the other end of the bed, Sophie watched and felt both panic and a kind of astonished relief. He was choosing procedure over concealment, responsibility over convenience. That thought warmed and frightened her at once. It mattered to her that he would not hide. It mattered, too, that the cost might not be easy. He sat back down and took her hand, but he kept it light, the kind of touch that patients and caregivers like both expect and respect. "I want to care for you," he said, "in the right way. I will make sure you get the attention you need, with someone who can focus on you without this getting complicated." Sophie nodded. Appointments and transfers and forms felt like adult things. They were not the language of romance, but they were the language of integrity. She felt as if, for the first time, someone had put their intention into words that mattered beyond the hush of a hospital room. It was not the grand declaration she had once imagined, but perhaps it was stronger, a promise of boundaries, of not letting desire carve shortcuts that could harm. He wrote an email while she dozed in the thin hospital bed between sleeps. He wrote to Director Carter with the calmness of a man who kept a ledger of what must be done. He wrote that he had a patient with whom he had developed personal feelings, and that the patient would be transferred to another clinician for ongoing care. He asked for guidance about how to record the disclosure and what administrative steps were required. He sent it, and then he pressed his knuckles briefly against his mouth and breathed out. Outside the hospital corridor, someone else stood in a doorway where the lighting gathered differently. Director Carter had come down for evening rounds because she preferred to see things with her own eyes, to let the hours beyond the office highlight what staff memos could not. She paused at the end of the corridor for reasons that had less to do with intention and more with the sticky, propulsive curiosity that all managers carry in some measure. Sophie was awake enough to feel the small shift of a chair as Daniel rose to speak to someone at the nurse's station. He stopped to consult a chart, his brow lined for a moment with the crispness of clinical decision-making, and in bending over a clipboard, his silhouette formed a curve that looked intimate from a distance. He reached out as if to steady a trembling hand, and Sophie looked up, their eyes catching in a breath that felt like static. Director Carter's view was framed by the doorway. The fluorescent light haloed the scene in an impartial brightness. For one breathless instant, she saw what everyone who sat in hallways and read file notes would be trained to notice. A physician leaning close to a patient, close enough that interpretation could slide toward impropriety for anyone who wanted to read it that way.
She saw a hand on a wrist, a head bowed, a posture that, absent context, would make good copy in a rumor column. Her lips tightened in a way that meant she was storing something up. She did not move. She did not intervene immediately. She stood very still, watching them with an attention that would harden into something that could not be undone by mere explanation. The doorway made her a witness, and witnesses had the power to reframe events with a pen stroke, an inquiry form, an official line in a memo, a phone call that altered the direction of careers. Sophie, suspended in her small world of breath and linen, noticed the shadow at the corridor's mouth, and had the sudden sick foreknowledge of being seen in a way that could be chopped into headlines. The knot in her stomach tightened, and the clipboard in her lap felt suddenly very heavy.
Daniel turned, and for a second he met Director Carter's gaze. There was no triumph in it, no guile. There was only the rawness of someone being judged by a frame that could only show fraction and not the whole. The director's face was taut with the syllables of consequences she had not yet spoken, but already weighed. She stepped forward in a way that held the inevitability of a bell tolling. Something in the corridor shifted like a held inhalation. The door hummed at the life of the hospital, and the moment split into two, the tenderness of the bedside and the administrative light of the doorway that threatened to cut the scene into something else. The air tightened, words that had been safe within the room now crouched at the edge of being public. Sophie sat there and understood, with a small crushing clarity, that the caution she had begged for had run straight toward the place the institution would notice first. If they found out, she thought. The sentence unfurled again in her head, a taut wire. If they found out, you lose everything. Director Carter's shoes made a soft sound on the tiles as she drew closer. Her approach was not theatrical, but it made the hospital feel like it had tilted. The moment held the fragile balance of approach and revelation, the private tether between two people in danger of being translated into broadcast. Daniel straightened in a way that suggested he had a story to tell, and had already decided to tell it with honesty. He whispered, low, to Sophie, words she could not entirely hear at first because of the hum of the machines and the corridor's activity. His hand squeezed hers once, a promise, and when he met the director's firm, unread expression, he did not look away. There was an earnestness in his posture, an acceptance of whatever the next steps would be. Outside the doorway, the director had already made a decision that belonged to her job rather than her personal impressions. Seeing was one thing, acting on what was seen was another. She had to weigh the potential for scandal against the need for fairness and protocols that existed for a reason.
She took one step into the room. Sophie felt all of it at once. The gratefulness that this man would not hide. The shame that their closeness, small and careful and still mostly private, had become visible. And the chilling, rational understanding of what would happen next. People in hospitals, even kind ones, sometimes did not keep their kindnesses private. People in offices sometimes could not resist turning observation into action. Daniel said, quietly, Director Carter. He stood where he was. His voice did not attempt to soften the edges of the moment. I was going to speak to you about a transfer. Director Carter's eyes flicked between them with the clinical efficiency of someone who had to balance rumor and evidence with personnel management. Her expression smoothed into a professional mask, but the tension at the corners of her mouth remained the sort that accompanied the opening of investigations, the kind that could not be undone later by apologies alone. In the doorway, the hospital light caught the edge of her file folder. She did not yet make a move to intervene, but in the way she held herself, Sophie recognized a shift that could not be reversed by comfort alone. She felt the reality of what she had said pulse against her spine, and the sentence she'd whispered into a hospital's private night air, if they find out, you lose everything, was no longer a hypothetical. It was an outline on the wall, a shape that had begun to be traced by a hand that kept the institution first. Sophie's throat constricted. She wanted in that electric moment to stand and talk their way past the doorway, to tell the director everything, to make the small rightness of what they had done visible in a way that did not threaten anyone's livelihood. But the city of institutions is not papered over by pleas or intimate explanations. It relied on procedure, on forms, on voices at certain levels of authority making decisions that would be recorded and read by others. Outside, the corridor lights hummed, impartial and bright. Inside, Sophie's hand tightened around Daniel's for a reason that had less to do with romance and more to do with survival. She did not yet know whether the survival would be for him, for herself, or for both. She only knew that the doorway was the place things changed, and Director Carter's face was the first public map of the consequences they had tried, delicately, to avoid. Director Carter closed the distance with the slow efficiency of someone who learned to let procedure give her courage. The fluorescent light hit the plain folder in her hand. Sophie could see the line of her jaw press into a thin, professional patience that had made and unmade careers more than once. Outside the clinical hush, the hospital's hum felt suddenly like a jury.
If you're already invested in Sophie and Daniel, tap like. Someone had scripted for 1,000 softer moments. Sophie thought of it like a small, absurd instruction and did nothing. She sat very still and watched as Daniel met the director's eyes and, as if punctuation were possible, spoke. "Director Carter," he said, his voice leveled with the same clarity he'd used on rounds. "I asked to speak with you because there's a personal conflict of interest. Miss Bennett is a patient of mine, and it's become clear I have developed feelings for her. I initiated a transfer of care a few minutes ago, and I'm submitting a written disclosure. I will recuse myself from any future clinical decisions involving her." Director Carter's face softened at the edges, not with mercy, but with a kind of relief people felt when a messy thing decided to be honest. "Thank you for telling me directly," she said. "We have protocols for this. I'll need a written statement from you and from the patient. We'll follow our standard conflict of interest procedure. For now, I'll place you on modified duties while we review." Modified duties? Sophie heard the phrase, and it looked like a file with scissors through it. The idea of modified duties suggested a liminal space, not exile, but not business as usual. Sophie felt something break and reassemble inside her chest. Part of her wanted to apologize until her voice eroded. Part of her wanted to ask the director to stop, to make the hospital a place where a mistake could be folded into ordinary life and hidden away. Daniel turned to her as if to make sure she was present and not about to evaporate. "Sophie," he said, and his eyes were gentled. Are you able to sign a statement, to be here for what they require? I can do it alone if it's too much." She thought of hiding. She thought of the headline that had made her small and clumsy in front of a computer screen. But she also thought of the way he'd leaned over a clipboard, honest about the transfer, honest enough to call a director in the middle of the night. She felt absurdly and fiercely that she owed him that kind of courage. "I'll do it," she said. The director nodded once and gestured to a nurse's station, where, under the neutral blue of a policy poster, forms were printed and signatures awaited. "We'll start the paperwork. We need clear accounts from both of you, and we'll speak with human resources in the morning. For the sake of the patient, we'll make the transfer as immediate as possible." Sophie signed with a hand that didn't quite feel like hers. There was a sense in which her handwriting had been doing other people's errands for years. Rent, shopping lists, forms for stray library cards, and yet this one was a different shape. It might be kept, read, folded into an electronic file that would be part of someone's permanent record. That knowledge made her feel like a witness to an event that would not belong to her alone.
Outside the hospital, the whisper networks of small towns and city wings moved faster than anyone wanted. A nurse who, doubling as a gossip conduit, told a sister at the front desk, who told a lab tech. By the time morning came, there was a cautious phone call from an editor who wanted to know more, and a message on Daniel's assistant's phone asking if he would still be speaking at a fundraiser. The first consequence was quiet and corporate, an email that rescinded an invitation, a canceled board meeting with a curt two-line note, a sponsor who asked a clinic administrator if it was true. Daniel handled each small cut with the economy of someone who'd learned the weight of reputation. He sent an initial disclosure to the director, then called the head of the foundation where he'd held a volunteer seat and told them he would step down pending the inquiry. On the sidewalk outside the bookshop later that afternoon, a teenager arranging a window display glanced at Sophie with that species of half-smile that meant, "I know." The bell above the shop door chimed, and someone asked if he'd seen the news. The question arrived like an aerosolized doubt. It lingered, and it clung. Sophie found herself absorbing the stares in ways she had no name for. People were kinder than she deserved, and harsher in equal measure. A woman in line for coffee raised an eyebrow as Sophie paid, and softened it into a small, embarrassed pity. A regular customer, the kind who bought the same paperback mysteries every month, avoided her counter for a week. A coworker who'd always liked her new haircut offered a journal of sympathy, and then closed with the practical, "Are you all right?" "Do you want me to come by after the next appointment?" Daniel asked once, his voice low, as if proximity might be a salve. She shook her head. "No," she said, "but thank you." There were, in the first heady days, points of humiliation, and yet also curious allies. A nurse who had seen the way Daniel had chosen to call it out, and had herself spent long nights in committee rooms, sent a text. "Good on you. People do the right thing only when it hurts." That text felt like a small warming. The hospital called a formal meeting with HR the next morning. The small conference room smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic. Director Carter sat at the head of the table, a human ledger. An HR representative with a clipboard introduced herself, explainable and officious. A note-taker sat with an impartial stare. "Ms. Bennett, Dr. Hayes," the HR woman said, "we need written statements about the relationship, the circumstances under which the doctor identified the conflict, and the timeline of events. We will also want to document any interactions that might be perceived as a violation of professional boundaries." Sophie listened to the phrasing and felt as if she were learning a new language, one in which emotion had to be translated into bullet points. She remembered the good faith of Daniel's phone call and the way he had asked the director to be informed. She remembered feeling fragile and steadier for the presence of another human in the waiting room. She also remembered the headlines she had read and the distance that had erected itself then. "Do you understand why this is necessary?" Director Carter asked. Sophie's face flushed. "I do." She said it with more softness than she thought she had. She didn't want to become a statistic, a column's anecdote. She didn't want him to lose everything on account of a tender, clumsy chapter. But she also didn't want secrecy to be the thing that saved him. Daniel took responsibility in ways that cost him small, immediate things. He offered to relinquish certain public-facing roles. He asked to be placed on modified duties that would keep him away from independent decision-making about patients he'd known in social settings. He composed, with a lawyer's aid, a short letter to the board of the foundation he chaired, tendering his resignation while their internal review took place. "Sophie," he said after the meeting, in a corridor that felt cold and long, "I don't want you to feel like this is your fault." "It's not," she said. She meant it and didn't mean it. She had been the one who had whispered the warning about losing everything. She'd been the one who had wanted secrecy out of fear. She had wanted to hide him and herself from the machinery of spectacle. But now, as the hospital's admin wheels turned, secrecy felt like a trap. "But I am the reason you made the call," she added. "So in a way, it is my doing too." "It was the right thing," he said. He had to face friends and colleagues who framed his decision as noble or foolish, depending on their proximity to power. The Foundation's communications director sent a concise note. "We appreciate Dr. Hayes' transparency. He will not be appearing in scheduled events until further notice." A commentator who once praised him for his work sent a private message. "Are you sure? Don't throw it all away." He didn't throw things away. He put them down with a clarity that had more to do with preservation than sacrifice. Preserve the trust of his patients. Preserve the integrity of the clinic. Preserve whatever human decency remained when headlines threatened to reduce lives into scandal. He accepted immediate administrative censure and the temporary loss of certain privileges. He signed forms that would end up in a personnel file. The cost was visible, but not cataclysmic. Rumors, however, have their own gravity regardless of administrative restraint. An unidentified post on a neighborhood forum speculated about impropriety. A local columnist who had earlier praised Daniel's philanthropy wondered aloud whether the intersection of wealth and medicine seduced good judgment. For every thoughtful friend who supported his decision, a dozen detached voices lined up to cast verdicts.
Sophie felt it in small, corrosive ways. The notice board at the bookstore had a flyer for support local health professionals that now looked like a placard in a parable she hadn't consented to star in. A delivery man paused at her counter and said, meant to be helpful, "I hope they don't make you talk to the press." She wanted to say, "No, please make me talk to the press. Let the truth cut through faster." When the initial inquiry convened, both Daniel and Sophie were asked to recount events. The HR woman asked about consent, about timing, about pressures. Sophie was careful to say what had happened without coquetry, without melodrama. She had been a patient. She had felt a connection at the clinic and later in the bookstore. There had been no exchange of gifts. There had been no transaction, no pressure. "I came to the hospital ill," she said, "and Dr. Hayes, he was kind. He did not take advantage of me. If anything, he has tried to protect me." The room listened with the neutral faces of people whose job it was to make a soft, moral sorting into a procedural outcome. Director Carter's face, when she looked at Sophie, was not unkind. "We need to be sure the patient's well-being isn't compromised and that professional boundaries are upheld," she said. "Thank you for your candor." "Will he lose his license?" Sophie asked, the question arriving like a stained shirt in a washed load. It was the question that had crouched in her since she'd first whispered the line in the hospital. "If they find out, you lose everything." The words landed, uninvited, in the sterile meeting room. Everyone's gaze passed over Daniel as if it might dislodge an answer from his shoulders. "We cannot predict the outcome of a review," HR said. "Consequences range from advisory reprimand to more severe options if policy was violated. Our role is to investigate, to gather the facts. The medical board would be involved if we determine reporting is necessary." Daniel exhaled. He had braced for catastrophe and found instead the precise, administratively dull shape of procedure. It was not mercy, it was a mechanism. He could live with it because it was, at least, a fair mechanism, one that did not prefer the sensational to the factual. Outside the hospital's glass doors, a television van idled. Once Covery Station's appetite was whetted, the city could produce a narrative. Sophie found herself clinging to the edges of privacy with a fierceness that surprised her. She went to the shop and arranged piles of paperbacks with the small, domestic rituals of someone trying to keep a life from splintering. There were low points. A magazine ran a speculative piece that suggested impropriety. It used a grainy photo of Daniel at a social event and layered it with coy insinuation. A colleague of Daniel's sent him a private note of condolence. So much for the benefits of renown, came the subtext.
Yet there were pockets of steadiness, too. A neighbor who brought over chicken soup. A patient who wrote a card thanking Daniel for his careful care years before. The balance between ruin and repair felt fragile and real. Weeks thinned into a month. The inquiry's wheels turned. Interviews, file reviews, statements. The clinic complied with the letter of policy. The foundation accepted Daniel's resignation from its board. The board released a short, sympathetic statement thanking him for his service. Director Carter oversaw the transfer of Sophie's ongoing care to another competent physician, a young clinician with a steady manner who asked practical questions and never peered into the soul of the waiting room. Daniel took a leave of absence from public events and began a regimen of quiet accountability. He met with a professional mentor, sought advice from an ethics committee, and attended a counseling program that the hospital recommended for clinicians who had to reckon with boundaries. It was not a confession in front of a crowd. It was work to reorient himself to a code that measured small acts as strictly as catastrophic ones. Sophie watched him move through it and felt the odd, proud ache of someone whose life had become entangled with another's by accident and intention. She did not want to romanticize his sacrifices. They were, she knew, also a practical necessity. But she found in them a consistency that made her trust grow. He had made the right choices when no one was applauding. The city, hungry for narrative closure, began to lose interest as the story settled into paperwork. The magazine that had run cynically softened its tone when the board's statement arrived. The article became a brief paragraph. The forum that once speculated moved on to weekend brunch recommendations. The world that feeds on scandal had receded enough for people to return to their own lives. By the time the hospital's internal review concluded, the outcome felt proportionate. The investigators found no evidence of coercion or deliberate misconduct. What they found was blurred boundary judgment, and insufficient separation between professional relationship and social familiarity. The report recommended a formal reprimand, a period of monitored practice for Daniel, mandatory ethics training, and the continuation of his leave until the monitoring arrangements were in place. It was neither ruin nor absolution. It was an adult consequence. Daniel accepted it. He did not flinch when the letter arrived. If anything, he looked relieved that there were rules that could be read and followed. He lost some glitter, the board seat, a few high-profile speaking engagements, the sheen of unexamined adoration. What he kept was the ability to practice under supervision, and the right to rebuild trust through steady, documented acts of professional responsibility.
Sophie read the report in the quiet of her apartment. The words diminished by their clinical voice, but the meaning heavy as plain stone. She folded the paper next to a bookmark and breathed as if she had just climbed a small, steep hill. There were no grand fireworks, only the slow, clean return of ordinary things. She went to work, ran the register, recommended a friend to a customer who loved poetry. She tried to live in a world that no longer pivoted on whispered headlines. One evening, months after the doorway scene, Daniel walked into the bookshop with an air that was both hesitant and resolved. He had been back in clinic in limited capacity for a few weeks, under monitoring and with a clear agreement about boundaries. He had been to the ethics classes and had met with Director Carter for periodic reviews. The measures in place were an architecture of caution that allowed him to practice without placing patients at risk. He paused under the shop's little bell and the light that had been his first real fragment of ordinary in her life. He looked smaller in a certain kind of human way. Less like a man curated for magazines, more like someone who had been paired by experience. "Sophie," he said, "do you have a moment?" She led him to the back table where the light was forgiving and there was a stack of new arrivals that could be tidied. He sat opposite her, his hands folded on the table, and there was a silence that did not need to be loud to be important. "I wanted to say thank you," he began, "for doing the interviews, for telling the truth, for being honest in a way that
I know I asked you to shoulder things you should never have had to. She looked at him. She had thought of the possibility of going away like a ghost, leave a life behind so that scandal might not brush someone else. But the decision they had made together had been to be honest. Her voice held a steadiness she had not always had. You did the right thing, she said. You could have, there were ways to hide. You chose not to. He smiled, but it wasn't the easy charm magazines liked. It was a small, private relief. I chose to protect the line that matters most, he said, not to protect the headlines. They talked about small things, about what the hospital asked of him, about the way cottage lights in his life had gone off and some had come back on dimmer. They didn't speak in grand metaphors. The conversation moved like a train through small stations. Trust, restraint. How to be two people without one of them being a trophy. At the end of that visit, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a plain envelope. Sophie felt her chest tighten because it felt like the sort of scene that belongs in another life, one curated for emotion. She had learned the cost of staging things. She had learned to distrust spectacle. She opened the envelope and found a short handwritten note. Integrity, it read, in his careful hand, is the place I want to begin whatever comes next.
No secrecy, transparency, and, if you want it, a real relationship only after everything is above board and you are free from medical complications of my role. He looked up, his eyes steady. That's the only way I would ever ask for you. If you still want me, the way I can offer myself is with my mistakes acknowledged, my hands clean in the procedural sense, and my heart available only after it's safe to be fully seen. Will you? Sophie laughed, because it was ridiculous and awful and perfect to hear him request permission like that. She had feared a grand, reckless gesture. Instead, she received a conditional offer that was scaffolded in responsibility. Yes, she said. Yes, I want that. They did not run to proclaim it. They agreed to be public in a specific way, a joint statement to the clinic that clarified the timeline and offered thanks to the staff who had acted professionally, an agreement that Daniel's transfer of care would remain in force until all monitoring was complete, a promise to any patient affected that their interests would come first. It was not a press release designed for virality. It was a document that respected the needs of others more than their own desire for privacy. Months later, in a small ceremony in the back of the bookshop, no press, only a handful of friends and a few colleagues, they celebrated a private covenant. Daniel had regained some of his standing through work and consistent accountability. Sophie had returned to a life that felt steadier. Director Carter attended in the way that professionals sometimes do, a nod across a room to signal that rules can be enforced kindly and that people can rebuild in honest daylight. When Daniel rose between the stacks to speak, he did not reach for dramatic flourish. He spoke of mistakes and of the slow work of earning trust, of responsibility more than romance. He told a short, unembellished truth, that people can be complicated, that love does not excuse bad judgment, that he had accepted consequence as part of honoring the patient and the profession. He took Sophie's hand afterward, not as a seizure, but as a request. The moment was small, an offered ring and an offered future that had been filtered through consequence and choice. He had designed a simple band, nothing flashy, only a small plain circle that symbolized their new constraint and new fidelity. Sophie, he said softly, I don't want anything I haven't earned. I don't want anything that's paid for by silence. Will you marry me, if with me, after we've kept promises to the people we must? She looked at him, and the years of smallness and quick tenderness and the hospital's fluorescent fear all pooled into an answer. Yes, she said, if we keep our promises. There was no grand proclamation to the city, no headline designed to smooth the edges of scandal into narrative neatly.
There was only a photograph a friend took on a phone, a small image that would circulate in the group chats of people who loved them, and not in the screaming banners of tabloids. The couple decided together what they would share publicly: the facts, the mistakes owned, the accountability steps taken, and a request that their private life not be used as a salve for spectacle. Director Carter hugged Sophie that night in a way that was steady and almost maternal. You did the right thing, she told her, and you, Daniel, you made the hard choice. He bowed his head. It cost me, he said. Not everyone will understand why I made it, but I couldn't have asked for better guidance. Sophie and Daniel's relationship continued,
not as a secret to be protected, but as a partnership rebuilt after consequence. He returned to his clinic work with new guardrails. She continued to run her bookstore with a quiet fierceness that had been honed by months of being watched. They learned the discipline of refusing secrecy and the art of being accountable to one another. Sometimes, when the shop bell chimed and someone came in to ask for a memoir recommendation, Sophie would find herself smiling at the regular rhythm of small lives. She would think of the corridor doorway and how a single witness could change the arc of things. She would think of the first time she had whispered, offhand into a hospital's hushed air, "If they find out, you lose everything." The line had been a warning born of fear. It had also been a prophecy of sorts. They had both risked loss and chosen transparency, and they had both been altered by it. They did not pretend the past hadn't happened. They made a small public note once, an announcement on the clinic's website, a paragraph that stated facts and consequences, and invited patients with concerns to call the hospital's patient liaison. That paragraph, in its understated plainness, was perhaps the truest thing they could offer: honesty as a way to begin again. Months after the reprimand and the monitored practice and the ethics classes, when the world had dimmed its appetite for judgment and learned to let them be two imperfect people with a lot of care for one another, Daniel and Sophie walked home from the bookstore together. The streetlights made a path of gold over puddles, and the cat they'd been feeding on the stoop winked in the lamp. Sophie slipped her hand in his and felt the small rightness of being next to someone who had chosen procedure over secrecy, who had chosen accountability over convenience. "If they find out, you lose everything," she murmured, not as a warning now, but as a memory they had both survived. "I know," he said, "and we didn't want the hiding. We wanted the truth." They kept walking. If you loved Sophie and Daniel's story or have thoughts on what you would do in their place, subscribe and leave a comment below. I want to hear your take.